Realistic career modes make FIFA more fun, and I want to share some of the tips that I've learned over the last few years. Most of the work when I plan out a realistic career mode is making the initial decision on what club to manage. If you take the time to envision a few storylines for your save, you'll have a sense of direction later on when you have to make tough decisions. Real-time performances play a big influence on which clubs I manage. Some things that you might want to look out for is if the team is over or underperforming in league or cup competitions. As most leagues are on break right now with the World Cup going on, it's an ideal time to carry over real-time performances. I've already made a video on how you can do this, but essentially you want to simulate each match day until you get the corresponding results. I use a site called Transfermarkt to sort fixtures by date, and that helps keep things organized. Going off that first point, if a team is lacking in any particular area of the pitch, either due to injury or just lack of spending in the summer transfer window, that could inspire the first few signings of your career mode. Take Liverpool as an example. Most fans feel that they need to strengthen their midfield and add some more youth to the side, so your first few transfers could check off both of those criteria. There's always rumored changes in management, and with that being one of the main new features in FIFA 23 to play as a real manager, it's a good feature to incorporate. I think if there's any storyline with a manager having ties to the club, maybe having played for them previously or managed them previously, then it's fair game to do a realistic career mode there. Squad player ratings and potential should have some influence over which teams you choose. I think it's important to ask yourself what sort of career mode you're looking for. Is it going to be a short, medium, or longer term save? A general rule of thumb I like to use is if you're managing a top team from a high profile league, don't plan on your save lasting more than 3 seasons. A mid-table team will probably have a 4 to 5 season save, with clubs fighting off relegation lasting 5 to 6 seasons. This is typically how long it takes for me to win the Champions League and be top of the league. After I accomplish those feats, I tend to lose interest in saves even when I'm fairly conservative and realistic with transfers. Another thing you should look at is if the club has any high potential players. I like to use FIFA to review player potential. Keep in mind though, as squad updates roll out, players are going to rise and fall in their overall rating of potential. Whether the club has some players with a real face scan also plays a role in my decision. It always adds the immersion, and if you're going to be with a save for a couple of seasons, it's definitely something you'll want to consider. The game's always going to provide a brief description over a club, but I like to do some further research. For example, are there any specific accomplishments or seasons that stand out? Winning a certain trophy could be an overarching goal for your save. You also have to ask what the club's overall transfer policy is like. Do rivals exceed departures or vice versa? These are all the sort of questions you need to be asking to see if the career mode is going to align with your personal preferences. Contrary to popular belief, winning the Champions League doesn't need to be the end goal of a realistic save. If you take a team like Freiburg, for example, they're very modest with their spending and typically let their top players leave to higher profile clubs. Due to this, the feat of winning the Champions League is always going to be difficult, especially if you rely on simulation like I do. So a more realistic goal would be to win the club's first major trophy, whether that comes from the Bundesliga, the League Cup, or other European competitions. There's an endless amount of research that you can do, but I think this covers the main questions that I typically ask myself. If you're feeling overwhelmed with choices, then I would recommend picking a league you have some interest in managing but maybe haven't explored in too greater detail. From there, randomly pick a team and work backwards, and you should be able to ask some of those questions and have a solid foundation to your realistic career mode. With the club chosen, you now need to create your manager, and if you don't have the option to choose a real manager, then I recommend just using the in-game editor. There's a whole community of people that post lookalike tutorials, so you can take some inspiration from that. Now, if the team you've chosen doesn't have a real stadium, you should be able to recreate something close to it. The introduction of stadium customization in FIFA 22 is an underrated feature. You can do a quick Google search to find the club's stadium name and adjust the seat color, the net meshing, and some of those finer details. For settings, my somewhat controversial take is to play with negotiation strictness set to loose. While it may seem counterintuitive to a realistic career mode, if you have the discipline to set your own restrictions, it's going to give you a lot more options that wouldn't be available if you had negotiation set to strict. As we transition to the next phase, leave a like on the video and subscribe so that we can get started with your career mode. The first step is to review your team and tactics. 90% of the time, I'll use the formation you load up with and create a second team sheet depending on what tactics the club uses. We're again going to use the trusty Transfermarkt site to look at some of the breakdowns of tactics that have been used in recent fixtures. Depending on the strengths and weaknesses of the team, you should be able to identify 1 or 2 positions that you want to improve in the upcoming transfer window. With that said, take a look at your squad roles and see which players might be untouchable from your starting 11. You can also see a breakdown of real statistics, see which players are making the most appearances for the club, and also featuring in the majority of minutes. Now, transfers make or break a realistic career mode. If you're too quick with things, it's going to lead to your save being boring. If you're too slow, then you do risk the possibility of underperforming and getting sacked by the board. As a result, it's important to plan out signings and maybe even think a few seasons into the future. I'll usually start by reviewing the club's recent transfer history to get an idea of a few things. 1, how much they're spending. 2, the leagues and nationalities that incoming player rivals have typically been from. And 3, what types of players are being sold and what does a typical transfer balance look like. For our first point, it's pretty common to see clubs spending more on transfers in recent years just with the way that the market has gone. But a good way to approach setting a transfer budget is to take an average of the last 5 seasons and try not to exceed that amount, especially in the first season when, in essence, the summer arrivals have already been made to the squad. I'll also usually try not to exceed 3 or 4 transfers in any given year, because if you go over that amount, the save's just going to get too easy, and again, you're going to lose interest in your save. When you have a list of common leagues and nationalities for a club, you can narrow down your search for potential transfer signings. Some clubs are going to have additional restrictions, like fielding a certain amount of players from a specific nationality, or perhaps including youth academy players in your squad. It's completely up to you how realistic you want your save to be, so I suggest doing the research and deciding from there. Something else that's important to consider is how well your club is able to retain talent. You're bound to have some high potential players, and it's completely normal to let them leave over the course of time. You can use past wonder kids at a club as a guiding principle, so go ahead and see how long they were a part of the team, how many seasons they spent at the club, and maybe once they start reaching the point that they're really up there in terms of goal contribution or have exceeded the overall rating of the rest of the players in your team, it may be time to let them leave. With those questions in mind, we can use some of the search criteria to find players that fit into the squad. As you start to identify talent, try to ask yourself if you can rationalize the transfer. For example, would it be a step up in terms of club or league competition for that player? Are there any other options at the player's club that might be leading to a lack of play time? This is especially the case when you get a few seasons into your save, so it may open the door to transfers that might not initially be realistic. Do yourself a favor and try not to go all out in just signing wonder kids. Everybody has a few go-to signings, but I try to challenge myself and not repeat transfers too much across career mode saves. What I actually do is keep an Excel sheet of the different saves I have and the signings that I've made. It's also fun to look back on over the course of the year, but all in all, it keeps things a lot more organized. When you're assigning squad numbers, look at a player's squad number history to see if any of those previous numbers are open in your team. With the start of a new season, it's completely fine to reorganize squad numbers, giving higher profile players priority. There are a few instances where clubs have retired shirt numbers, so check and make sure there's no overlap there. As you get further into your career mode, different storylines will present itself. I almost always start the season by searching for high-rated free agents or players with high potential. You can narrow down the search by looking for players from the club's nation or the most common 4 nationalities for the club. Just make sure the free agent signing isn't too high rated by taking your squad average overall rating and signing a player that maybe doesn't exceed 1 or 2 more than the player's overall rating in your squad. It's not uncommon for former players to return back to a team after a spell elsewhere. We saw it in the most recent transfer window for Paul Pogba at Juventus. And it's especially common for older players to end their career where they got their start. I always keep track of a club's best youth academy products so that if it's ever realistic for me to sign them and return them back to the club, it can make for a great storyline. Now, I treat youth scouting very similar to how I treat transfers, with a few added twists. Look at a club's network of top youth academy players, and that should inspire you to establish some scouting networks. Your initial scout should almost always stay in the club's home nation, but as you progress further on, you can assign more scouts by looking at the club's top 4 nationalities, a manager's nationality, or playing/managerial history abroad. There's also nothing wrong with just scouting some of your favorite nations, so have some fun here. Leave a like if you found this helpful, subscribe if you're new, but until next time, this has been Flick. I'll be talking to you all again soon.